feel very, as I told, very much connected to the Institute of Criminology in Oslo. And I've met Len in relation to my research on human trafficking. Actually, last year, I guess, in Tallinn. And I thought it would be really, really nice for Len because now she has this experience of doing research in Estonia. Also to present maybe and to give this flavor. Okay, and I'm so sorry, Len, I need to leave or and look for latecomers. Okay.
Yes, I was prepared for you being busy. Yes. Thank you. Okay, I won't be having any slides, but we can leave Niels up there. My topic fits well with many points made by Monica, because I will speak on kind of based on my research on human trafficking, often presented as a monstrous crime and as modern-day slavery, with ideal victims and ideal perpetrators, to use the terms of Niels Christie. And studying the issue up close, diversity emerged, and this has made me and others interested in the link between how the crime is presented and perceived, and the fact that punitive measures are dominating the way anti-trafficking policies are developed around the world. So I will return to that. First, I want to thank you for the invitation. Anna invited me after meeting me at the Ministry of Justice here in Tallinn last year, and the opportunity to talk about victimological challenges to contemporary criminology. I'm especially happy to be presenting them here in Estonia. As Anna mentioned, I have been coming here for many years and have both research collaborations and friends here, and not least I have particularly focused on Norwegian-Estonian links in crime and crime control. About 15 years ago, Norwegian prostitution markets were undergoing some noticeable changes. The most visible of these was the fact that street prostitution markets were increasingly becoming international, with participants from outside of Norway. And in this period, early on, we saw particularly Estonian women present in street prostitution in the largest city in Norway. And for the first years of establishing anti-trafficking policies in Norway, just after signing the UN protocol in 2000, trafficking from Estonia was the main point of reference. This changed after a few years, but was very evident in the beginning. And this meant that patterns of the crime and the needs of those particular victims came to dominate and form Norwegian anti-trafficking policies. What police looked for, what welfare services were developed, and how the courts deliberated were for many years to come done with just Estonian trafficking in mind. Only a couple of years ago, I interviewed a police officer in Norway who spoke nostalgically about those early years of his work on trafficking, where he found it easy to divide victims from non-victims and to recognize perpetrators. And while trafficking sense became a more diverse phenomenon, it became more difficult to know how to operate as a police officer. And he worked in an anti-trafficking unit. So the complexity of it made it more difficult to do policing of trafficking. It, of course, is the case that this is also a lot to do about stereotypical perceptions of Estonian and early trafficking. But even in the first trafficking case ever prosecuted in the Norwegian court had victims and perpetrators from Estonia. And this case and others gave the Norwegian police experience in cross-border police cooperation that has become so important since. So it was kind of a major turn in the investigations of organized crime, multilateral cooperations between police officers. We now hardly find Estonian women in Norwegian prostitution markets or linked to trafficking cases, nor more than UK or German citizens. But the early learning from Estonian cases has not disappeared. And my earliest research on human trafficking was with Estonian victims and on court cases involving Estonian citizens. And this has linked me to organizations and research also here. And what I noticed early on in interviews with Estonian victims of trafficking was how their transnational experiences was both a problem and a solution in the situations they were in. Most had migrated to countries like Germany, Cyprus, Norway, Sweden, and Finland voluntarily, or they have wanted to migrate, but had, because of migration restrictions and lack of funds, become dependent on moneylenders and migration brokers. And this meant that the starting point of a situation, while the starting point of the situation might be a voluntary form of migration, it became exploitative. After getting out of trafficking situations, many continued to travel back and forth between Estonia and other countries for and through prostitution. And this was made possible because of the existence of the border. This made me interested in what borders do. The border creates opportunities, desires, and some protections I've found. And in my empirical work, I have explored this further. And through my earliest work among Estonian victims, I became interested in border crossing, something which has thoroughly changed me as a scholar. So that therefore it's particularly fine for me to be able to talk about that here in Tallinn. I have given my talk the title Transnational Victimhood, Challenges for Prosecution and Victim Protection. And when I talk about the transnational, I mean this in the sense that it points to processes, relationships, and organizations that moves across borders and belong several places. And this is very different from the term the international, which refers to processes, relationships, and organizations that belong to nowhere in particular. And it's important to think about the terms we apply when we talk about relationships across national borders or that goes beyond the national, that we kind of keep track of how we use the terms transnational, international, and global. So that's an interest of mine. The last 2 decades have seen a heightened awareness of transnational crimes and their victims. Obligations to prosecute such crimes and afford rights to victims are outlined in supranational instruments, but implemented with different resources and thresholds at nation-state level. A central challenge in this is how to balance efforts to prosecute perpetrators and appropriately recognize and assist victims. So with the case of human trafficking in mind, I will describe how the relationship between prosecution and protection is balanced in different contexts and outline how this raises some general criminological concerns to do with global and local inequalities. The aim is to move beyond recognizing that crime prevention, prosecution, victim protection are moving cross borders, to also investigate what the transnational movement does. So my starting point is my own research on human trafficking, but I believe my points are also relevant to other empirical fields. In recent years, I have investigated this through 3 collaborative projects. One explicitly discussing how prosecution of trafficking and the protection of its victims are balanced in how police and prosecution handle trafficking cases. Another project looking into how human trafficking law, immigration policies, and victimhood constructions taken together produces a situation where possible victims of trafficking are subjected to surveillance, stigma, and deportations. And the third project is one where we juxtapose how sexual war violence as an international crime and human trafficking as a trans-border crime raises some general criminological concerns over rights and justice and who decides. The background to how most states handle trafficking is the UN Trafficking Protocol, often referred to as the Palermo Protocol. My research is exclusively on human trafficking for sexual purposes, for prostitution and sexual exploitation, which in most of Europe is also what is predominantly policed against. So for those of you who also work on labor exploitation, you must forgive me for kind of recurring all the time to trafficking involving prostitution. That is my area of interest and expertise. The UN Trafficking Protocol, the Palermo Protocol, has had a tremendous success in the sense that very many countries have signed it and ratified it, and in the sense that it has thoroughly transformed domestic policies, not only on labor exploitation and on trafficking per se, but also thoroughly transformed policies on many areas, particularly immigration policies and prosecution law. And this might be a case of what Prabha Kotsivaran has termed an over-inclusive interpretation, which has produced some collateral damage in terms of border controls and increasing surveillance, which I will demonstrate in the case of Norway. What is interesting to me about looking particularly into transnational crime is how it brings into view how crime interacts with issues of mobility and migration, and not least in terms of how governments approach such crimes. And I will give an example from an ongoing research project with sociologist Synnøve Jansen, because we have been working on a project where we look at how transnational prostitution and suspected trafficking is managed today, and we argue that the focus is on it has created a particular constellation of prostitution law, human trafficking law, and immigration law that informs us of, that it gives us information about wider contemporary concerns over mobility and security, but also over sexuality. And by applying these three sets of policy areas, prostitution, trafficking, migration, exclusionary and inclusionary strategies are combined. And the end results in terms of the situation for people involved in transnational prostitution, whereas some are victims of trafficking, is that they face an increasingly harsh and an increasingly generous treatment by the Norwegian state simultaneously. So I'm going to show some examples of this, because our analysis brings into view some debates that are taken up currently in several strands of criminology on how criminal law interacts with other policy areas. Control of what happens inside the nation state and control of access to the nation state are, broadly speaking, governed by different laws, criminal law and immigration law. But in addition, there are acts to do with border crossing or that are extraterritorial in the penal code. And there are acts that deal with violations of the criminal law included in the Immigration Act. Criminal law and immigration are thus not separate systems, as many of you are familiar with the term crimmigration of Juliet Strumpf. Internationally, but the reality of how various laws interact needs to be explored empirically, and that's what we're trying to do in this project, trying to understand how international instruments such as the Palermo Protocol gets kind of translated into local context. Because international policy instruments like the Palermo Protocol ensures that trafficking is approached in a uniform way. It's supposed to. But what remains true is how governments and frontline personnel deal with concrete people are formed by available discourses, legal cultures, and forms of regulation already available from other policy fields. So I will give examples of how the criminal law and immigration law interacts in the particular case of Norway, and how this transformed the transnational character of the crime impacts on this particular combination, on the balancing of prosecution and trafficking and protection. The first example is one which demonstrates how the combination has led to increased surveillance and control of women who sell sex, in a particular segment of it. The second example show how this particular combination poses some challenges for the rule of law and the safety and welfare of victims of trafficking. And the third example deals with how immigration to Norway is curtailed as a mean of protection for trafficking. So the first example is to do with how the Norwegian government purport to rescue victims and society for human trafficking, but also unwanted forms of prostitution by linking criminal law and immigration law. And this has to do with particular forms of police activities, operations, that has as its aims to unrest the market, but also to recognize, to identify trafficking. So by doing quite large-scale raids in indoor prostitution venues, particularly involving foreign women selling sex, has been argued for as a way to identify victims of trafficking, but it has so far not led to concrete cases. What has been the case instead is that under these raids, during these raids, the crimes of the suspected victims have been conveyed instead. So they have found drugs, lack of documentation, and they have found, so in the action of trying to save them by raiding where they work, they actually take the women in, and many are deported because of their own crimes. And this is a very particular combination where the argument, the rationale is the penal code, and the aim is to save the women, but they detect immigration crimes in the process. So the kind of transnational character of human trafficking and the fact that victims might lack documentation, lack legal residency in Norway, is then informing or influencing how these raids actually play out. And the fact that women who sell sex are monitored and searched also when they are themselves not suspected. So the raids are not because they are suspected of committing crime, it's because they are suspected of being victims. So this focus on document checks together with raids according to the penal code produces this outcome of saviors ending up deporting suspected victims. I say suspected because that's the terminology the police use on the victim as well as the perpetrators. And also in street prostitution markets, this is a widespread practice, that the main contact between police and foreign women in prostitution are document checks. And in this way, and this is argued for, so this is the other way around. They use the Immigration Act to establish contact with women in prostitution to be able to identify trafficking. It's the rationale for these checks, but it's not evident that it actually has this effect. So how do police work against this combination of the pimping paragraph, trafficking, and we have also a ban against the purchase of sex that comes into consideration here? It produces a situation where all women who sell sex, whether they work indoors or on the streets, are available for police enforcement in different way than before, and in a different way than the rest of the population. Also other parts of the population that are possible victims of crime. All in all, this way of linking the work against human trafficking and pimping on the one hand and illegal residence on the other entail a strong escalation of police intervention in the prostitution market and the life of people who sell sex, women who sell sex. They don't enforce these laws in prostitution that involves male sex sellers. Nevertheless, since the main focus of this action is to prevent human trafficking on paper, this means that it doesn't affect all individuals who sell sex to the same effect. This is directed at foreign women. And because the border exists, foreign women are controlled at the border and in Norway, but not Norwegian women selling sex. And this makes it more evident for foreign women selling sex that the border is everywhere than for most other migrants. Because migrants are not, migrants generally, also other illegal, kind of irregular migrants, are not susceptible to these kind of document checks wherever they go. Because they have a status as a possible victims of trafficking, they have more difficulty hiding their irregular status. The victim status attaches to them, and thus the border is where they are. So this is one of the, this is an effect produced by this kind of combination. And the police can then kind of make use of an apparatus, both the immigration and the criminal law apparatus, and combine it in ways that they can argue for in public debate as being practical. Police have been critiqued for this increasing the vulnerability of victims of trafficking or migrants in prostitution, but they argue that this is a price worth paying for detecting trafficking. The second example is how offenders are used to disclose, to identify other offenders by how immigration and criminal law work in tandem. A major challenge for police in recent years has been obtaining witnesses in trafficking cases. Human trafficking is a crime where one often depends heavily on courtroom testimony from victims. Therefore, it is important to have access to these. Because of the way residency permits and assistance to victims of trafficking is organized today, it may take a long time from the identification of a victim of trafficking until the police is able to access a rich and credible description of trafficking. And police in different parts of the country, of Norway, has dealt with this in different ways. While the Oslo police have given priority to work towards foreign women's indoor prostitution and street prostitution in the way I described earlier, by raids in indoors and document check in indoors prostitution, Hordaland's police district have another take. For the police and prosecution to be able to build a good human trafficking case, there is an urgent need to initiate the investigation early, and in this, it's an advantage for the police to have an active role in it, according to the Hordaland police. And Bergen Airport is in this police district, and access to border control there is considered a major reason why Hordaland police in recent years have uncovered and won a number of trafficking cases in court. Police have identified several of these cases through first having uncovered violations of other laws on the hand of the victims. And not offences to do with prostitution or trafficking, but, for example, drug possession, lack of documents, and all kinds of also quite small things can lead to the suspected victims being taken in for questioning. They apprehend the suspected victim and inform them that they are under custody for committing a crime or a misdemeanor. But if they instead come forward as a victim of trafficking, the case will take a different turn. And this apparent hunt for victims that can appear as witnesses in court, that takes place at the border, at airports, does not only mean an involvement of the police capacity to uncover and prosecute trafficking. It also means that people coming to Norway that are suspected to come to sell sex and might be victims of trafficking are more susceptible to control at the borders than others. There are specific nationalities, there are, of course, gender, and there are other indications that the border police make use of to make strategic stops, hoping that they can catch the person having committed a crime so they can ask them questions in a separate chamber. And this attempt to uncover human trafficking by accessing information from suspected victims that turns into suspected criminals does not only appear at the airport. Also elsewhere, this is a familiar method for uncovering human trafficking and to produce cooperative victims that will then be willing to witness. The police doesn't necessarily see any problem with this strategy, but it has been taken up by lawyers and recently also in a concrete court case how this is a problem for the rule of law. And even one of the lawyers I interviewed said this about this. This creates a dangerous situation vis-à-vis the rule of law. If someone say they are a victim of trafficking, they are believed, even though the story is not coherent. I believe that there are cases where one does not problematize enough whether the story has been told to access right, and that cases that are in reality not trafficking cases are counted as such. So in this second, and there was also a ruling in a major case where the judges in their deliberation explicitly referred to how testimony is given under the threat of punishment and with the temptation of a residence permit, which might come out in the other end, poses serious challenges and threatens the credibility of the witness. So, in this sense, the transnational character of human trafficking and how it's associated with cross-border activities is not only influencing how the police works towards the possible perpetrators and how policies are developed, but it's also apparent in how victims are treated. And in this sense, his or her access to rights are curtailed depending on cooperation with the authorities. The third example of how kind of laws or sets of laws are combined to kind of for pragmatic reasons in this particular field, there has been very much creativity in finding ways of handling trafficking, and before that handling transnational prostitution. So a wide array of policies has been applied, but currently it's the tandem of immigration control and the penal code that is in vogue. But the third example also deals with how the Penal Code and Immigration Act are interlinked in how cross-border prostitution and suspected trafficking is approached. And this is by how alleged victims are stopped at the border, not as in the last example to serve as witnesses, but to be returned to the country they came from, to prevent other people from committing offences, or at least committing offences in Norway. A study I participated in 2006, and this rings true even today with new interviews, airport police describe this practice, that when they come across women they suspect of being victims of trafficking, they turn them around. They find reasons. They have kind of it's completely legal to sell sex for foreigners in Norway, but there are all these other ways of stopping people from entering the country that they use pragmatically, also in other instances, like the need for funds for the stay and knowing the name of the person you're coming to visit, or giving a credible reason for the stay, etc. But they are taken aside and asked questions about their trip because they come from particular nationalities. And if they are suspected to be victims of trafficking, they are not helped, but they are put on their own ticket, returned to the country they came from on their own account, on their own cost. And this is formulated by airport police and others as a way to protect the women, as a humanitarian intervention. That one keeps victims outside of the country to prevent crime in the country can be understood as an expression of the idea that the threat of crime comes from outside. To keep Norway free from human trafficking and to prevent Norwegian men to become customers involved in trafficking cases, one should exclude foreign citizens in foreign elements. So women who are suspected of coming for prostitution are thus given the responsibility and guilt, at least the consequences, for the crimes of others, even though they are not the criminalized party in neither prostitution nor trafficking. So this points to how this happens at the airport, but the idea that one should prevent crime by preventing alleged victims' access to Norway is also institutionalized. In 2011, the Council of the Baltic Sea States, that Estonia are also part of, issued a trafficking manual for employees of embassies and consulates. Norway has been very central in the Baltic regional cooperation, also or particularly in efforts to combat trafficking. And the manual is intended to provide guidelines for the Norwegian Foreign Ministry staff in embassies throughout the world. And the handbook gives advice on how they, as representatives of Norway, can recognize human trafficking and how they should deal with it when they suspect someone being a victim of trafficking. The handbook recommends, quote, "You should not issue a visa if you think that the person may be at risk of becoming a victim of human trafficking," quote, end of quote. So this is a case where they reject a visa application for someone that may become a victim of trafficking at a later stage. And this is a quite serious intervention based on very little accountability. They don't give written deliberation or grounds. They are just rejected. And this is very well known from the field of human trafficking, that states tend to prevent trafficking by preventing the mobility of women. And it is also well known that this can again increase the vulnerability of the same women, as it pushes them into using intermediaries and forces them to migrate irregularly. And today, these travel restrictions for women, or particular groups of women, are partly justified, as I mentioned, by a desire to protect them. And feminists have fought to establish the focus on women's vulnerability, but the success of this struggle has had some possible downsides, as it opened up for new forms of control of women, as that both restrict their freedom and their rights. Just try to look. I have lots of sheets here, so I need to think about which one was next. Yes. So what is interesting here is how human trafficking has gone from being a kind of what Lee has termed, quote, human trafficking has undoubtedly been transformed from a poorly funded NGO feminism of the early 1980s to a global agenda for politics of the US Congress, European Union, and United Nations, end of quote. And although the international women's movement has been instrumental in placing human trafficking on the agenda and has emphasized the use of legal strategies in this regard, it is relevant to ask how this has coincided with and also given legitimacy to issues of security and nationalist agendas. This is what Elizabeth Bernstein argues on the basis of an analysis of the US context, that we see the advent of a carceral feminism that allies with Christian right-wing forces to gain strength in their efforts against prostitution and trafficking. Bernstein argues that this alignment of feminism and right-wing punitive agendas has replaced a broader agenda focusing on other aspects of justice than criminal justice. And using criminological insights to investigate how control and welfare are related also implies highlighting how measures adopted on humanitarian grounds can also be punitive in their effects, as the humanitarian rescue on the border I described earlier. So, stricter border controls and instrument curbing asylum flows are often listed as anti-trafficking measures in the action plans around Europe, including the Norwegian ones. DNA testing of minors and stopping people at the border are listed as humanitarian intervention. And as I mentioned, this is done despite the fact that there is reason to believe that this increases vulnerability by making border crossing more expensive and more dependent on agents. I'm approaching the end now, but with the fact that this balancing we see in these three examples, where the needs of the police and their need to prosecute appear to be placed over the needs of victims, since they are deported. Seem to be little regard for how these punitive approaches might make victims more vulnerable. And so then an important issue is whether legal strategies, while beneficial for the cause, because what the police argue is that there is a greater goal, that they are to produce trafficking cases. As a society, we are to prosecute trafficking cases, and there will be individual victims that have to pay a price for that. But they talk about the cause, as does feminists, some part of feminism in this. So the term collateral damage is very kind of apparent. And several have written about how trials also for sexual and sexual violence and also for human trafficking might be re-traumatizing for victims. So this eagerness to produce court cases needs also to be balanced against the needs whether or not this is actually what the concrete victims are in need of. So the society's need to produce victims that can serve as witnesses is not the same thing as criminal justice approaches being the best way forward for concrete victims. And in addition to the prospective harm of being questioned in detail about violence, the court setting requires a particular narration of the events, where ambiguity and agency need to be left out in order to produce the victim as an ideal one, to return to the concept of Nils. Something which might impact negatively on the recovery process, which is very evident from research. So a central challenge when criminal justice approaches are prioritized is also how this might curb the establishment of other institutional responses. When prosecution and criminal justice are prioritized, this also reflects a deeper understanding of what human trafficking is about and how it can be best addressed. When victims are given protection based on cooperation to achieve a prosecution, as in the case of Norway, where if a victim takes part in a case that produces a verdict, they get a permanent residency in Norway. And this can be read as their exploitation being a question primarily of criminal acts. But in most cases of trafficking that I have encountered, they have not merely been a question of cynical criminals misleading and exploiting victims, but also anchored in a deeper structural vulnerability and on the part of those exploited. It's not merely a question of ending trafficking by locking up the bad guys. A prominent criminal justice approach might deflect focus from the pressing needs to address deeper structural conditions that continue to facilitate exploitation. And with these points in mind, I encourage criminologists to pay more attention to what border crossing does. So in this case, how the act of border crossing has influenced how police approaches people in prostitution, for example, has thoroughly transformed the whole policy field. And the way this border crossing has been envisioned heavily impacts on how these people are treated as migrants. Not just so I think we should more than observe that transnationalism is a characteristic by the crimes we study. I think we should also investigate what that entails and what kind of effects that produces on laws, on how laws and ideas about what laws are, what happens when they cross borders, what happens when ideas about victimhood travels across borders, and how we evaluate and think about agency, power, and exploitation. Policing today takes place across border more than before, and how does that change domestic policing as well? And a kind of critical note also, how NGOs are becoming major players in how they have been able to traverse borders and mobilize across jurisdictions. So in many of the big debates on the punitive approaches towards trafficking and also transnational prostitution, NGOs that purport to speak from grassroots movements has been among the most punitive in their approach. So transnational movements in this field and others, the cooperation and the traveling of ideas that takes place, they are transformative. And just as my scholarly thinking was transformed by early experiences with exploring how transnational lives in prostitution and human trafficking is lived, policing, politics, lawmaking, NGO work, social work is changed by how actors can not only develop and implement policies with a national context in mind, but needs to see that context as a part of a greater whole. In criminologists' endeavor to explore how our objects of study are developing and being influenced, policing and influenced, it is necessary to apply a perspective of power and look for who stands to gain from the direction such transformations are taking. it is obviously necessary to look into how gender inequality produces markets and victims of crime, particular patterns of victimization. It is also quite evident what we need to explore whether Western hegemony is maintained by this, or whether this instead opens up for more real bilateral and multilateral exchange. Less obvious is perhaps how we also need to think about the power NGOs have been able to acquire through being able to operate multi-locally and engaging local concern in the international policy agenda. Harm and inequality is not only produced by states, cooperation and individuals, but also civil sector. As I mentioned, who are pushing in this particular area for more punitive agendas and more closed borders. We should take the opportunity to problematize the eagerness that states demonstrate in approaching trafficking by punitive criminal justice policy or immigration restrictions. Criminological research can contribute to a more sustainable and just approach to transnational crimes by integrating also sensitivity to how we see transnational victimhood and approach transnational victims. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Len. That was fascinating. So we've got plenty of time left for questions. So.
Or people might be tired.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts. Recently, Amnesty International, on behalf of sex workers around the world, called for decriminalization of prostitution as a measure that would offer sex workers more protection from violence and exploitation.
Yes, the whole discussion on prostitution messes up the trafficking discourse and vice versa. This is inseparable as policy areas, and arguments of trafficking is used to facilitate particular policies on prostitution and the other way around. And it's a very complicated issue, and there is this battle between international NGOs on who has the right to speak for victims and who are the true representatives of people in prostitution. So this battle of representation is very much a core of this, where Amnesty International say they represent the sex workers' rights movement's interest in having decriminalized the sector, while feminist organizations and others argue that this is just in fact playing kind of the ball into the corner of traffickers and clients, and not in actuality benefiting people in prostitution. And if we want to think about politics as something that people who are kind of part of a sector should engage in, it's very difficult because it depends on who you believe in. So the whole representation issue is a big one there. A major argument for Amnesty for their position is that they believe that this will both make life safer and better for people in prostitution, but also in terms of trafficking, that it will facilitate identification. And the other side says the opposite. People are tired, it's late.
Two questions.
If you could paint a picture in relation to the Norwegian welfare landscape and whether trafficking sort of transcends the social, sort of punitive social policy in relation to what, for example, so in the UK with this, like there's an awful lot of discourse around welfare and benefits, you know, sort of tourism. And one of the things around in relation to trafficking is that the more people who present as a family, the more welfare they're able to access. And there's been sort of discussions around, well, so are people trafficking children and presenting as like larger families so they can gain more access to welfare? And then of course we've now had reductions in welfare for larger families in terms of how many people there are, not necessarily directly related to trafficking, but that discourse has played into it. I'm just wondering if there's anything similar in relation to sort of welfare and finance.
Yeah, in most European countries, the generosity has been tremendous towards victims of trafficking. I'm not saying all have equal access to it or that it's suitable, but that a big system of assistance is built in most countries. The UK has been most hesitant. They didn't want to write signs onto the Council of Europe Convention because they feared it was too generous for victims, so it will make people become victims of trafficking so that they could move to the UK. So it's been, but most countries, I think politicians are afraid to be meager when it comes to trafficking. It's hot on the political agenda. They need to prove that they are taking this very seriously and being very generous towards victims. So I have been surprised to the lack of critique of the resources that are submitted to the field in Norway and elsewhere. I did an evaluation of the aid system for victims of trafficking in Norway. And when you do head counts, there are social workers outnumbers identified people many times. So it's very little question. So it's not integrated in the ordinary welfare system. It's an exceptional system built for exceptional people. And this lives on. I'm surprised that this hasn't produced more outcry in Europe, except from the UK where it did.
I think Amelie had a question then? No, you didn't? No? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Just out of curiosity, what is the outlook of the sex industry, clandestine, whatever form it is, in Norway? And how does the...
What did you mean?
So how does the market...
How it looks like?
Yeah.
Okay.
And how does it relate to the police response? And I'm asking this because talk a lot about victims and, you know, the serious human side of all this. But sometimes I think that, you know, what explains best a police reaction to traffic is actually the infight between, you know, the establishment, you know, and emergent capitals. So, for example, in Greece, where trafficking became a national sport at some point, there was no particular care for its enforcement. The composition of the market and the entrepreneurs that were involved in, you know, like importing material for the sex industry. I mean, a colleague of mine calls this a primitive accumulation. He calls Eastern Europe a women mine of sorts. And so, you know, I'm moderating in this debate. But I think that the way the market is composed, the composition of the market, the outlook of the market, and police enforcement are very intimately related at the end of the day. So have you related those in the case of Norway?
Yeah, I can say something about the market. Because Norway signed the Plenary Protocol at the same time as prostitution markets started to become more international. There had been foreign citizens before. They had also been exploited. We have horrible cases, but they weren't really interested, the government. But with the trafficking protocol, there was a very emergent interest, which is both based on the international pressure and the protocol, but also the fact that the market was changing. So in Norway, we have seen a very big change in how the market has developed in terms of its in the multiplicity of nationalities that are involved, and very few ethnic Norwegians are left. And we see some shifts in which nationalities, and so the street, what this kind of politics that I described, this police intervention, what that produces, is very different from different parts of the prostitution market. I meet with ethnic Norwegian women who says this is in their benefit because the police leave them alone and they hassle everyone else. It's very good for their market position. So this doesn't really have anything to do with them. So they're not the target, not of the trafficking law, not of the pimping paragraph, and not of the Sex Purchase Act. For all these three acts work in tandem to combat trafficking, and they are argued for as means to combat trafficking. So what happened with men's prostitution? What happens with prostitution involving ethnic Norwegian men? It's left alone, and exploitation identified there is of little concern. So the policy, but the driver, the composition of the market has definitely been a driver in policy debates, saying there are floods of immigrants, there are floods of Nigerians particularly. In the beginning, there were concerns about the Estonians as well, what would happen if... but after a while, in 2004, Nigerians started coming. That shifted the debate heavily. It became a very different kind of phenomenon. Yeah, in how people saw it. Did that answer your question, or?
It will be a long conversation. So
Yeah, we can talk later.
Just a clarification. So when you were saying that women, that police check the documents of the women traveling regularly, you were speaking about Nigerian prostitutes?
All nationalities, but particularly the most recognizable as possible victims of trafficking or possible women in prostitution would be Nigerians.
So this means that Nigerian came to Norway with fake documents or?
No,
sort of
it differs.
documents?
They had residences from Southern Europe, or it's a combination of things. But they could be taken also down from other kind of misdemeanors for carrying too much cash, carrying too little cash. They were stopped. The police were looking for reasons to stop them so they can get them in a room on their own, or deport, just expulse them from the border.
Inside the market of prostitution, at least in Italy, of course, the prostitutes identified as victims of human trafficking are a small minority. Anyway. But when we go to the, for example, media representation of prostitution, somehow they appear to be like almost a majority. Something like this happens also in Norway, and if yes, in your opinion, why?
Yes, I think it happens everywhere. That it is also confusions about the definition. So that when people say there's very little, it might be that they allocate a too narrow definition, because the definition is also much broader than many people think. But many politicians and media will speak of prostitution and trafficking as almost the same, that all prostitution involving foreigners are in fact trafficking. So this takes place in discourse, but it's so difficult to know the actual figure of human trafficking and to compare between countries what the ratio are. So I do research among Nigerian women, and most of the women I've known, and it's hundreds, have very exploitative histories. People have exploited their migration and prostitution in various ways, in the past or in the current, and for a great many of them, it's in a way that I would say fits to the legal definition of trafficking. But whether it could be proved in court will be very difficult, and so it depends a lot also about the unclarity of the definition that produces this uncertainty about how much trafficking there actually is, and of course the heat in the public discourse that just also kind of amplifies the phenomenon a lot. So,
but don't you think also that at the level of the academic debate, trafficking somehow eats all the discussion on prostitution?
yeah.
Now we always speak about trafficked person and trafficking, and the debate on prostitution is almost dead. At least in Italy, this is really evident. Like the idea that if you are a prostitute, you are a trafficked person, and then everything is there, and there is no more discussion on the rights of prostitutes as prostitutes and not as trafficked persons.
And also like a dangerous overlapping between exploitation and trafficking, you know?
Can I just come in on that one? Because we did some work here in King's Cross, and we were looking at big sex markets there in the area, and they decapitated them very successfully in a sense. They hit these basically drug-using white class women with ASBOs, and it was pretty horrible. But at the same time, the drug market was changing because the new social media allowed it to go underground in all sorts of ways. And I want to come back to this point here, because in a sense, to go back to Monica's paper, you know, the security state is driven forward by these discourses of finding suitable enemies. And one of the suitable enemies of our time, along with the gang member or the terrorist, is surely the human trafficker. And we put all our kind of eggs in that basket, whereas sometimes more plausible explanations seem to fall by the wayside. Like now with European more open borders, lots of people can come into England. And someone did a very interesting piece of research by going into these kind of checking up on Eastern European women, all of whom were suspected of being trafficked. And they was basically saying, look, in a sense, to channelise their argument, was, well, I could do a Mac job for £5 an hour, or I can sell my beautiful body to all these white men for a much greater sum, which seems to me explanatory more powerful. Yeah, as I said, if you look at the policy discourse, it's the trafficking that gets it, that then creates the preconditions for the industry that starts to emerge around it. And the various entrepreneurs and people that claim to talk for prostitutes, that claim to sort of want to control and regulate them. So it does seem sort of like an interesting one, just draw a parallel between what they do.
Yes, and it's also it also interacts with other fears about kind of suitable others, in the sense that in the late 90s it was the former Soviet states that was the big fear, Russian mafia. So also Estonian prostitution, women in prostitution traveling to Norway would be seen as possible part of Russian mafia. And then when the Nigerian women started to come, we had a whole area, the whole issue we have now with the Mediterranean, but also fears about the masses at the gate at the Mediterranean. And then with the accession of Romania and Bulgaria, what are we afraid of now? Yes, the Romanians. So it also fits well with concerns over security issues, terrorism, and over other parts of crime, like and organized crime, very much linked to those kinds of discourses. So, and it doesn't necessarily fit with the numbers of kind of the size of the market at particular times. So it's easy to track it to more general fears over the different significant others at different times.
Yeah, certainly.
I thought you were talking about human trafficking.
Yeah.
But you never said anything about children.
No. I also said in the introduction that I only speak about prostitution, trafficking for prostitution purposes. But there are women I interview who were trafficked as minors, and several of the court cases I take as a starting point involves minors, and I do research on minors also broadly in trafficking. But here when linking particularly to, they are treated in a very different kinds of apparatus and the whole new set of concerns. So
We can take a question from Andrea and then Mary.
yeah.
Was not a question, was more like a comment. I mean, this argument of Simon, or what is exactly that some people prostitute themselves, make this weird analysis calculation, if you were to find quid in a shop or sell my body for more money. I think that is very much an internalization as well of what you said before, capitalism and neoliberalism as king as God. I just wanted to connect these two comments as well, because I think it is for me at least, problematic argument. I'm for the decriminalization, but I hate that kind of calculation that is really problematic in itself. Yeah. That's all. I wanted to just comment on comments.
And if I can comment on your comment, it's I've also written on this, on how the idea of being Western and of being a modern self also promotes this narrative of the choosing subject, and it's very, very powerful. What kind of person doesn't choose for herself? So I think this makes it very hard to understand the personal, kind of the histories leading up to trafficking, because the narrative of the modern choosing self in a neoliberal state is so strong. Yeah. And many of the women I've interviewed, they want to be modern, they want to be Western, and they want to choose like Western modern women do.
Mm-hmm. And the good choice is always the fragmentation.
Yeah, so it's complicated. But my experience is that women enter prostitution and end up in trafficking relations for many different reasons. Yeah, it's a continuum.
Mary?
Thank you very much. I think what you've depicted for us is a very fast-moving and very fluid landscape in which one set of criminal concerns segue into several others, and everybody's commented on those. I was just wondering, however, what strategies or counter-narratives might be mounted, even when it looks incredibly challenging and difficult in these very deleterious times. In particular, have there been any successful campaigns or perhaps legal challenges? Or is the political scene and is the legal scene changing so quickly and so fluidly that the strategies of legal challenge, perhaps in some of the more conventional strategies of resistance, if you like, are becoming ever and ever weaker?
One of the challenges for that is the fact that many of the people involved might not have interests in line with each other. Mm-hmm. And there are so many complications to this case, so it's so difficult to take side and engage in a kind of a fight for a better kind of policy. And in terms of what I began with, saying that keeping the eye on the victim, applying a victimological approach, and ask every time someone purport a solution to trafficking, the end solution to trafficking, I say, what does that mean for the victim? Because the victim is the core of the policy debate. This is best for the victim. And then asking, is that really the case? Or is there actually other agendas going on? So this humanitarian intervention that produces these very negative outcomes for victims in particular context needs to be made visible to people. And in the case of Norway, this has been done a lot, but the police says, and politicians says, this is the price we all have to pay to combat this, the modern slavery of our time. So it's hard.
I thought as much.
Yeah.
I had to ask.
Yeah. But I think that to stand stand with victims of trafficking, and also not kind of sacrificing also including looking at exploitation, is a way forward.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I think we'll wind up there.